All right, so the foreign and defense ministers of India and the United States, that's Dr. Jaishankar and Mr. Rajnath Singh, will sit down with their U.S. counterparts, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, to try and assess the global situation as it stands right now. They will also take stock of the bilateral situation between India and the United States. But I suspect the Israel-Hamas war will consume a lot of their time, because both countries, strategic partners as they are, would want to take a converged position on where things stand between Israel and Hamas, the war in Gaza as it stands right now, and more importantly, where it's proceeding. Joining me now is a former U.S. envoy and now currently the head of the U.S.-India Business Council, Ambassador Atul Keshap. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for speaking with us. A pleasure always for you to join us here on CNN News 18. First things first, I want to ask you about the horrific October 7th Hamas terror attacks. 1,400 Israelis died, and in response, Israel has launched a massive operation by air as well as by land now, in which the Ministry of Health in Gaza says over 10,000 Gazans have died. There is growing pressure on Israel as well as the United States, I would say, because they're trying to get a humanitarian corridor going. They're trying to put pressure on Israel to minimize the civilian casualties. What is your assessment, and you've served long years there in the Middle East, of where the war is right now and how it is likely to proceed in the near term?
Well, I think it's very important to remember that terrorism is completely unacceptable in all of its various forms. There's just no justification for the senseless slaughter of innocent people of any religion, of any community, of any background. And that goes in every possible direction. You know, as an American who has lived in a country that has been subjected to terrorist attack, speaking to Indians over this medium, Indians have, of course, been subjected to so many terrorist attacks. That kind of instrument of policy is completely unacceptable, wildly unacceptable. There are other ways to pursue political goals. And so the other thing I think we have to recall is that the loss of life of innocent civilians on any side of a conflict is a tragedy. And so what's critically important is that all of the governments in the region try to limit the scope of what is happening. And I think that the U.S. government is certainly trying to play a very constructive role. You know, you look at Secretary Blinken, who's been in the region constantly, and his engagement with all of the various parties, you know, trying to stabilize this before it gets out of even the boundaries of where it is right now is extremely important. You know, one thing that I feel is that zones of instability are not only growing in this world and smoldering out of control, but they're actually coalescing. And it's making more and more of a challenge for pillars of stability, like the United States and India, in trying to limit the growing instability in our world.
I do want to know your thoughts, and I'm curious to know, when the October 7th attacks happened, obviously the entire global public sympathy, as it were, was with Israel. As you'd expect, you know, no one expects, you know, terrorists to come in and behead babies and, you know, rape women, take elderly and women and children as hostage. And even today, a month on, there are more than 200 hostages there. But as this conflict progresses and the civilian casualties in Gaza mount, there are now thousands of them. Half of them, apparently, of the 10,000 happen to be children. Where is that point? Where is that threshold, you believe, Ambassador Keshap, that Israel sort of risks losing the moral high ground? And also from an American point of view, clearly the administration, at what point does the administration say, okay, we need to take a step back here and say, we need to put an end to the civilian casualties? Yes, Israel needs to do whatever it can in its power to try and secure itself, but that does not mean a license to kill indiscriminately. Where does that point arrive?
So I spent a decade of my professional career as a diplomat working on the Middle East. And, you know, we can get into a lot of history, but frankly, I am more worried about stability and the pillars of stability being able to work to fend off what I see as growing instability around the world. You know, if you look at what's been happening in Syria, for instance, and Libya and Yemen, all countries that I worked on, these are areas of wide-ranging instability that have a destabilizing effect on the entire region. You know, if you look at the world from the perspective of Washington, and certainly I think maybe from the perspective of Delhi, there is this worry that growing instability is coalescing. So look at how Washington and Delhi and Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Jerusalem have all been working together to try to limit instability in that region, to try to create economic and infrastructure opportunities that would strengthen stability in a very destabilized region. You also look at what's happening in Europe right now, where we have the absolute worst war since World War II raging into its second year, maybe even third year very soon. And I think that when you look at the world from the perspective of Delhi or Washington, what you're looking for is partners who can buttress and enhance stability, because fires that rage out of control can also burn your own house at some point. And so for the great stable democratic powers, it's very important to work together at this point. The other thing, of course, is everybody's looking at the Indo-Pacific, and that's where the 2+2 focuses.
I'll come to the 2+2 in just 1 second, but you did mention that there's already, of course, now the Israel-Hamas war. There was already a full-fledged war between Russia and Ukraine, and there's always the possibility of the Indo-Pacific, China, Taiwan. And the question that's being asked again is, you could argue, and there is some degree of truth to it, the coalescing between Russia, Iran, China, and these three different theaters. And ultimately what it boils down to is they're all coming together in a way to challenge the existing global order. And the existing global order has been the same for the last 75 years, since the end of World War II. It's an order that's led by the United States, that's hugely beneficial, not just to the US and its allies in Europe and in Asia. It's also hugely beneficial to democratic countries like India, Israel, Japan, South Korea. What do these countries do to preserve this ongoing order, which is under serious threat by the likes of Russia, Iran, and China? What, in your opinion, can be done to preserve the prevailing global order?
Well, I don't disagree with your hypothesis, although I don't have any clear evidence of it. I would say that in Africa, where I grew up, the Russians have been lighting fires in as many places as humanly possible to try to create challenges for France and the United States and Britain and other countries, and also, frankly, to create instability for Africans themselves. If you look at the lending being done by some other countries for infrastructure and it not paying out and creating excessive debts for countries in Africa, it is clear that some sort of effort has been underway to try to weaken the sovereignty of countries. And that's why we always used to talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific, where countries have a choice. And so if you look at the 2+2, and to get to your question, I think what the United States, India, and all the other countries you mentioned are really deeply invested in is seeing that countries around the world be sovereign, that they be free, that they be prosperous, and that they have choices, and that they can make good choices for their people. It is directly in the interest of the United States, speaking as a private citizen and a pensioner now, to have stable, prosperous, and ideally democratic societies. We're not in the business of hollowing out countries, making them fragile. We're in the business of trying to strengthen them, because a strong country doesn't need help, right? And right now, the U.S. is spread very thin, dealing with all of the countries that very desperately do need our help. And I think India looks out at the world and sees things the same way in its region, in the Indian Ocean, and frankly, across the entire Indo-Pacific. So the 2+2 is, of course, extremely important. It's critical to me that in this very challenging geostrategic moment, the United States and India are having their defense and foreign ministers meet together. It sends a very strong signal of our affinity and our partnership and our trust in each other. And I think it's all about, frankly, strengthening countries so that we don't have further zones of instability.
And I want to get a final word. You did talk about the 2+2, while the bilateral between Delhi and Washington is perhaps in the best of health in the last 20 years, whether it's on the defense side, critical emerging technologies, you name it, space technology. There was a very successful state visit a few months ago. What is a bit of a concern, if you will, is when it comes to multilateral issues. On the Russia-Ukraine war, the Indian position was slightly more nuanced, slightly different from the position taken by the US. Even on the current Israel-Hamas war, while Prime Minister Modi, within the first few hours of the attack on October 7th, came in and unequivocally supported Israel and said that we're siding with the victims of terrorism, India has had to sort of walk back to its traditional position about, yes, we believe in the Palestinian cause, and yes, we believe in a two-state solution, and so on and so forth. Do you see that, the difference in nuance when it comes to multilateral issues, sort of affecting the relationship?
I actually agree with you that our bilateral relations between Delhi and Washington are as good as I've ever seen them in my life. And I think that that is because not only of the natural affinity between our people and now our governments and the trust that we have since the pandemic, the rather significantly reinforced trust that we have since the pandemic and all of the terrible lessons that the pandemic taught us, but also because of rising concern about where the world is going, right? So there may be some areas of disagreement, but really the need uh, we have for one another is going to transcend those. And I think that both governments have proven themselves very adroit over the past 2, 3 years in sidestepping problems before they become real issues in the relationship, either by finding mutual understanding or mutual accommodation, or even, as very mature partners do, sometimes agreeing to disagree.
All right.
And that's okay.
Ambassador Atul Keshap, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much, sir, for speaking with us here on Brass Tacks on CNN News 18. Thank you for your time.